And
Recording in progress.
all right, so in this lecture, we're talking about the second Romanov Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich. Alexei Mikhailovich, here is a picture of him. He was, as far as we know, the first Tsar to sit for a portrait. That portrait is no longer extant. This image I'm showing you right now was painted posthumously. That means after he died, sometime around 1680, when we know when much more portraiture is starting to be done in Muscovy. So, but maybe this is a likeness that comes pretty close to picturing what he would have looked like. So right now we're going to talk about his reign, and a lot goes on in the reign of a lot goes on in the reign of Alexei Mikhailovich. And again, you can always know, so remember that patronymic. Mikhail Fyodorovich has a son, names him Alexei, and because his dad's name is Mikhail, he becomes Alexei Mikhailovich. So that's the patronymic is always just tells you who's someone's dad was. And I think that the main themes going on in this reign is that the government is growing. We are seeing state building in terms of a bureaucracy building, more people working for the state. The state, although let me say this super haltingly and don't exaggerate, I think the state is becoming more ambitious and capable. And the empire is growing. So we've got a growing government, growing state, growing empire. In that with that super general comment, these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about. And in this lecture, I'm going to treat these unevenly. So we're going to cover geopolitical stuff. And pretty much we might say that if at the start of Alexei Mikhailovich's reign, you would see Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as more powerful. By the end of Alexei Mikhailovich's reign, pretty much people watching can see that the tables are turning and kind of Poland is on the down and Moscow is on the up. It's becoming more of a regional power, stronger, calling more of the regional shots. In this context, there's a tremendous amount of cultural change. Some people have characterized this cultural change as a westernization. Thousands of people are coming in. Think about it. In our course, we've been reading accounts of Europeans, 2 in the 16th century and 2 in the 17th century, who are coming to Russia, observing, watching a society in change. And maybe something you'll notice in Olearius, or do keep your eye out for it. He often is saying things like, recently, reading his account really gives a sense that this is a society undergoing change. Or when we talk about it, disagree with me if you see it differently. But maybe that's one question we might ask. I mean, in what ways do we see this text reflecting a society undergoing change? That change is cultural, with Western ways of doing things and dress and books. There's a lot of spiritual change. And this is the thing that I'm going to skip over in this lecture entirely, because I'm going to lecture about it next time. And that is the schism and the emergence of the old belief and this kind of meeting of different religious traditions in Eastern Europe. The incorporation of Ukraine is something I'll mention lightly, and we'll talk about that more concretely next time. But in this lecture, one of the things I do want you to walk away with a really strong sense of is the domestic unrest that is happening in Russia during the reign of Alexei Mikhailovich. There's salt riots in 1648, copper riots in 1662. In the 1670s, Stenka Razin is a Cossack who really gives the state a run for its money. All of this unrest are indications that all this growing of the state, which includes upping one's ability to collect revenue and field a big army, doesn't come without growing pains and resistance. And in the midst of that, we do see a state that engages in a lot of domestic reforms, and it will issue a law code in 1649 called the Ulagenia. We'll talk about that. So here is kind of just some dates of who's who in the 17th century alongside the double-eagled emblem of Russia. And that double-eagle emblem, who remembers under which reign we first see it associated with Moscow? Ivan III, back in the 15th century. When it was a really unoriginal pick. The Habsburgs also used a double-headed eagle, and so did some other states. But nonetheless, Russia picks the double-headed eagle, and to this day, we'll see it. Putin has even trotted it out some. So this is just a list of who's who, and this is kind of how things go. You can come back to this image and study it, but we have Mikhail I, and then his son Aleksei, who will have many children, and we'll talk later about that. This is a wonderful chart right here that shows you the whole Romanov dynasty. In the 18th century, it gets really confusing. But here are some images of our 17th century czars. So here's Aleksei Mikhailovich. Here is Fyodor Alexeyevich, his son that will be czar for a while. But again, just like Fyodor Ivanovich, Fyodor Alexeyevich is also a not very healthy and short-lived czar. So they're easy to confuse, but two short-range Fyodors. And then we'll have Peter will emerge as czar. There should be a picture of you on here as well. At any rate, okay, Aleksei Mikhailovich. So that's just kind of a great big preface to some of the things we're going to talk about, with me having made this point that he is presiding over a change of great social and cultural change. So stability has been more or less restored. And think about it, if you were him, we've had, after the death of Fyodor, we had Gudunov take the throne, and then his teenage son takes the throne and is murdered quite quickly. And then Shusky is chosen as a czar, and he doesn't really last long at all. And then after a period of great chaos, we have the Romanovs chosen. And so Mikhail has his reign, but then he dies, and Aleksei Mikhailovich is just a teenager. So at some level, if there were people on the ground thinking, is this going to be it? Was the Romanov dynasty a flash in the pan too? So there's a lot of, I think that even when the teenager Aleksei Mikhailovich is taking the throne, there was a degree of uncertainty about how successful that reign might be. Spoiler alert, it ends up being marvelously successful as far as dynasties go. And by the end of his reign, I don't think there's many people walking around thinking that the Romanovs are going to get ousted. But in February 1613, when his father died, he was 16. Sorry. No, that was, I was reading about Mikhail. So Aleksei Mikhailovich comes to the throne, and he comes to the throne. He doesn't have a big fancy coronation right away. What they usually want to do is get married first. And when he was 18 years old in 1647, he got married. And at that point, the way in which a bride for the Muscovite Tsar was chosen was through a bride show. I mean, it's almost impossible to think about this and not really think Cinderella. Here I'm drawing a lot in this wonderful book called A Bride for the Tsar by Russell Martin. And so what happens was 1647, 200 maidens, all of them of kind of middling noble families, but not really high aristocratic families. And this is important. There's a reason for it. But 200 maidens are listed as eligible, and they were brought to Moscow, put up in different families. They don't really have a big hotel industry at this point, but they're kind of put in the homes of noble families, and they were assessed. They were brought to court, and their beauty, their health, their family line, and their dispositions were assessed. With Aleksei Mikhailovich, the groom-to-be has nothing to do with this process. And gradually that number gets reduced to 6. And one of the ways in which that number got reduced is that certain women would conduct physical exams on these women. Do they have childbearing hips? They would, I don't know the full extent of these exams, but family interviews, have her female relatives given birth? Were those children robust? Did they live long? Because one of the most important things of a dynastic couple, to come out of a dynastic couple, are heirs. So that's a really important issue, and a sense and kind of a family history with unusually high mortality could be disqualifying. So gradually this list of 200 women was whittled down to 6. And at that point, Aleksei Mikhailovich is allowed to choose. The records told us that these women, and this is a 19th century portrait dressing up, and this misrepresents the record because sources tell us that they were presented to him, but he was behind a screen. So they're not actually meeting him. He is looking at these women and was allowed to choose from behind a screen. He reportedly chose the daughter of a provincial nobleman whose name was Euphemia Vsevolozhskaya. And on hearing of her good fortune, we are told, this girl fainted. Well, her fainted was interpreted to be due to falling sickness, which might mean that she couldn't be an able mother and might not birth a robust heir. And so she was deemed ineligible. There's rumors, however, that foul play may have been involved, that some really heavy-hitting boyars didn't want Euphemia Vsevolozhskaya for whatever reason to be chosen. And so it was murmured that when she was being dressed for her audience, that they tied her headdress so tight, and this there was a Russian headdress, it's not so well represented here, but it was tied so tight that it cut off circulation and caused her to pass out. And other rumors circulated that she had been poisoned, perhaps at the machinations of a very powerful man at court, Boris Morozov. One peasant of a boyar was investigated after this incident, and was investigated for witchcraft, that maybe he had cast a spell that made her not be eligible. So at any rate, Aleksei chooses Euphemia Vsevolozhskaya, but he's not allowed to actually marry her. No marriage happens for a while. He reportedly fell into a bit of depression because he liked the looks of her, I guess, and he comforted himself by engaging in charitable acts, focusing on his faith. He goes down in history as an extremely pious czar. He spent a lot of time in church. That's one thing Peter really departed in. Peter I, he didn't spend nearly the time in church that his dad did, although he could quote Bible and verse. At any rate, poor Euphemia Vsevolozhskaya and her dad, they get sent out to exile in Siberia, one of the early exiles in the town of Tyumen, where I did much of my dissertation research. A year later, a new match is found that seems to satisfy Aleksei as well, and he marries a woman named Maria Miloslavskaya. Maria Miloslavskaya was the daughter of what's called a new man, someone who had from pretty unfamous or not too exciting or elite origins, who has risen up in the service of Boris Godunov. For example, she had a great uncle that traveled to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire as part of a state embassy, and then also traveled to Holland in 1646 as part of a state embassy to recruit metallurgists to try and develop mining resources in Russia. I share these two facts with you just to show how much Russia at this point is engaging with its neighbors and other parts of the world diplomatically. It's not this isolated backwater that the real champions of Tsar Peter the Great would have you think. Russia is often portrayed as completely isolated and dark and backward until Peter came along and opened up Russia to the West. Studying the 17th century completely dismantles that impression. And so these examples of diplomatic relations already traveling to far parts of the European and Near East are indicative of that. At any rate, so the wedding was a joyful occasion, but sober. He didn't let any, atypically, he wasn't a big drinker, and there was no alcohol at the wedding, which was quite untraditional for Russian weddings, which were celebrations that would go on for days and quite a bit of drunkenness. The marriage was very fecund. She would go on to bear him 13 children. All of the women were longer lived than the 5 boys that she bore. Of the 5 boys she bore, Dmitry died at 2 years old, Alexis died at 6, Fyodor died at 21, Simeon died at 4, and Johann died at 29. So, so none of the 5 male children she had lived past 29. Of the women were, some of them longer lived. Now, Maria Miloslavskaya, she died in 1669, 4 days after giving birth to her last child, Yevdokia, a girl who sadly only lived 48 hours herself. And in just 2 years later, Aleksei, he remarried. He married a woman, Natalia Narishkina. And Narishkina was, some say, although this is a contested point, that she was raised by a Western-leaning boyar, spent some time in a household that had a Scottish woman in it, and so had more exposure to Western ideas. We do know that she seemed to have liked theater, and that she may have convinced Aleksei to have an actual theater and a play put on in the Kremlin. This was new for Russia. You know, Shakespearean England has been enjoying, Shakespearean London has been enjoying plays for coming up on 2 centuries at least. But this is something that is very new to Russia, as will be portraiture, for example. People have been having, since the Renaissance, lots of portraits painted, but it only really takes hold in Russia in the 17th century as a cultural practice. And it said that this first play was, it was like a 9-hour long play. So you think this Zoom lecture is long, try and sit through something for 9 hours. At any rate, so we associate Natalia Narishkina with kind of more forward thinking, being open to innovations. And so I kind of love this painting, that there's little to suggest here in this very modest, very covered Muscovite dress, that she's on the cutting edge of things. But there you have it. And to be fair, this isn't in my understanding a portrait that she actually sat for. Now, at any rate, there's something really important to know for all of Russian history about the fact that Aleksei Mikhailovich had 2 different wives. So from his first marriage with Maria Miloslavskaya, the son who lived the longest was Johann. Johann was not entirely healthy. He had health problems, cognitive and physical. And so it was well understood that he would not be a capable ruler in his own right. Natalia Narishkina, however, had a son who was very robust, and this would be Peter the Great. But just kind of a little bit of a preview, because we won't quite get there, but we've talked a little bit about marriage. So marriage was super important into how Muscovite political culture ran. And if we saw Boris Godunov trying hard to make international matches, perhaps part of this conservative turn is that Russia isn't, they've been invaded by some foreigners. They're not going to mess with that. They choose their wives from the Russian world. And that's a tradition that will obtain for a century. But they don't just choose their wives from any Russian world. very importantly, they don't choose their wives from the highest ranks of the elite. They choose their wives from more modest ranks of middle and noblemen. I mean, you can't be nobody. It's not Peter the Great will come along and really bust some norms when he marries a woman that was probably a former serf. So they can't marry you kind of a nobody, but it has to be in a much lower rung. Why is that? Well, historians like Edward, several historians have now worked out and identified the reason for that was that Muscovy, more than having kind of the czar be all powerful, was the power really lay in the circle of super elite boyars around the czar. And they're calling the shots, but they're also in jealous competition with each other for the most influence. And it came to be understood that to pick a bride from the most elite would upend and kind of affect and make that balance, that competitive balance, lopsided enough that it could lead to unrest. And so kind of a compromise was, we will take into this very high position someone from a lower family. And yes, it will raise their status, and some other new family will effectively join the ranks of this now most elite. But it's better than having one of our own rivals kind of go head and shoulders above us by having that already elite status plus access to being part of the dynasty. And so this was sort of, through marriage politics, worked out a kind of solution that kept a more kind of stable drive for this elite oligarchy at work around the czar. It meant that being the wife of the czar, super coveted position, and these families were really powerful. So when Aleksei will pass away, and then his son Fyodor will be the czar, and when Fyodor dies early, there is a huge, tremendous power struggle as the heirs of the Miloslavskaya family want their son, even though he is unfit to rule clearly, to take the czardom, while as the family members of the Narishkina clan, they want their son, Peter, to take the czardom. He's younger, he's of the second wife, but he's healthier. There's a big struggle, and the solution that gets worked out is that they're going to be co-czars for a while with a female regent. That's kind of a preview, but as since we won't go into the 17th century in depth, I really want you to have a sense of this, how important the marriage of the czar was, and how studying it has helped historians get a better sense of the workings of this political culture. All right, a couple really quick words about geopolitics in the reign of Aleksei Mikhailovich. Eastward expansion across Siberia continues apace. That's all I'll say about that right now. In the war with Poland, they're finally going to get Smolensk, and they're going to do even better. So that if Poland is kind of the more powerful power in the region when Aleksei takes the throne, it'll be the opposite when he finishes. They go to war with Poland. They fight a 13 years war. It ends with something called the Treaty of Andrusov. And in this, Russia will have Smolensk and kind of keep it forever. They'll also get Kyiv. So this is where Russia starts really drawing the boundary of its map around territory, which includes Ukraine. Not all of Ukraine yet, but in 1667, it takes Kyiv and the eastbound of the Dnieper River. And so we start to see, in the reign of Aleksei Mikhailovich, Russia taking Ukraine. It will also fight a war with Sweden, and it will also have complicated politics with Cossacks. We talked a little bit about that. One thing I do want you to know about the reign of Aleksei Mikhailovich is that he avoids war with the Ottoman Empire. There's potential for it, and as the Crimean Tatars are becoming weaker in their own right, and increasingly being a vassal and puppet of the Ottomans, the Moscow and the Crimean Tatars have been in contention and kind of Moscow actually paid tribute to the Crimean Tatars quite a bit in the early modern centuries so that they wouldn't attack them, and didn't, with some exceptions. But the government of Alexei Mikhailovich seems to have understood we are not in a position to kind of go at it with these people, and was savvy and reluctant to engage in war. And one example of that we already talked about when we talked about the Cossacks. Remember, I said how these Cossacks took this fort on the Sea of Azov and offered up to Alexei Mikhailovich, hey, look what we got for you. And Alexei Mikhailovich's government was like, no thanks, because we see, as much as that might be a nice, wonderful thing to have at the mouth of that river, with trading opportunities, etc., we recognize that that's a problem we don't want to take on right now. So even as Russia is kind of directing its politics to its west and being able to kind of take Smolensk back and win a war against Poland, who just decades before had invaded it, and also go to war with Sweden, although the question isn't settled on who's more powerful in the 17th century. It will happen in the 18th century, but they quite conspicuously don't go at it with the Ottomans. I think it's something to be aware of. All right. We'll talk more about religion and its relations with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What I want to go to now is talk about this issue of domestic unrest in the 17th century and how Russia deals with it. Let me come to this. Okay, so it's fighting wars. Wars cost money. And the state, to fight these wars, raises taxes. And landlords squeeze their peasants a bit more in the 17th century than they had been before. If you'll remember, serfdom kind of becomes a thing from the 1590s to 1649. And there's this big debate in Russian history, when do serfs really become serfs? Or when do they lose the right to leave? And we know that in the 1590s, there's so much unrest that their right of departure is suspended year after year. So there's no kind of juridical law saying these people are serfs, they don't have the freedom to leave at all, but effectively that's what's happening. And then in 1649, they juridically say these people don't have the legal right to leave. And we can trace out tensions. And some of the tensions that are happening, one of them includes that the Tsar, as the Tsar is calling on its people to engage in warfare, they end up, for more days or whatnot, they squeeze their own laborers for a bit more days. And so we see unrest, the type of unrest that maybe feeds Cossackdom in a way we've already talked about. That said, the Tsar is, amidst cavalry armies, we're starting to have armies that call for more infantry that are going to carry guns. To field an army with infantry and guns is more expensive. So the Tsar needs to raise more taxes. Now, here's a fun fact that's a little hard to get your head around. The richest people don't pay taxes in Russian history. They provide army, they serve the Tsar in various ways. They have to pony up to go to war, and they have to pony up to go to war. And then there's all kinds of particular moments where they might maybe get voluntold to give some big gift of thousands of rubles to the Tsar. So the Tsar gets something out of them, but they don't pay regular taxes. Who pays regular taxes? Obligations are collected from serfs, not always entirely in land, and in the townspeople, merchants, artisans, people that live in towns, they pay taxes, kind of what you might see as property taxes. And the church is largely exempt from paying taxes. So as the Tsar is trying to create more revenue, those townspeople that aren't even the richest people in Russia, they get squeezed more and more. And this is the source for a lot of for the domestic unrest that I'm about to tell you about. So one of the Tsar's main advisors was a man named Boris Morozov. And in addition to he's a boyar, really noble, and he's super rich. And he proposes to the Tsar that in order to raise more revenue, you up a salt tax. In the early modern world, pre-refrigeration, everyone needs salt. They catch fish and they salt it. You have meat and you salt it so that you have something, protein to eat during the winter. Also, cabbage you ferment it using salt. So everyone needs salt. To have the government taxing really modest people, taxing their salt and raising those taxes, everyone feels that. And so in 1648, he makes a very unpopular move to raise the salt tax again. And in a result, we have riots in 1648. Actually, if I don't know that you want to look at this the whole time, so maybe I'll just stop sharing. The immediate catalyst. So in 1648, what occurs are called the salt riots. And the immediate catalyst for this is the Tsar refuses to accept a petition. And I'm going to tell you this story because I think it also indicates something important about Muscovite political culture. On June 1st, 1648, the Tsar Aleksei is returning from an annual pilgrimage from the Trinity Monastery. He's heading back into Moscow. And as he's returning, surrounded by his guards of Streltsy, that palace guard that Ivan IV had founded and at first established, common people approach him. And according to local custom, they come up to him and they came out to him some distance from the city, and they brought bread and salt, kind of sustenance and flavor, gifts of goodwill in Russian traditions, and wishes for all good fortune to the Tsar. They asked the Tsar to accept these gifts and to accept their petition about a particular boyar named Plasheyev that they thought was one of the evil advisors. This is a big trope in Russian history. You never blame the Tsar himself, but the evil people around it. Of course, I've just told you that the real power is in the elite people around it. So there's maybe a lot to talk about in there. But at any rate, these people want to bring him a petition against Plasheyev. This is a corrupt person. He's squeezing us too tight. Please, merciful Tsar, intervene and do something on our behalf. Take care of us as we expect you to do. But in a very atypical move, the crowd was not only not heard, but the musketeers shot at them and chased them away. This was a real affront to that traditional right of petition that Russian commoners understood themselves to have. 16 people from among these petitioners were arrested and put into prison. The crowd followed the entourage back to Moscow. On the next day, several thousand people had gathered, angered by what they had heard had happened the day before, and they pushed their way through the gates of the Kremlin. They demanded satisfaction. They wanted those 16 people arrested, and they wanted Plasheyev handed over. Morozov tells the Streltsy to put down the mob. In that moment, many of them say, "We take orders from the Tsar, not from you." Some even went over to the mob. The mob goes off around Moscow and they break into and they sack the houses of many wealthy of many wealthy boyars. They sack Morozov's house. They go on and they get Plasheyev's house. They go to this man Traktionov's and also the resident of Nazarchisty. People who have studied this event, looking back, they say this violence was not random. They're just not busting into any wealthy house. They are busting into the homes of the people they understand to be the architects of their suffering, the people to be behind the policy, the policies that are hurting them the most. In all, 70 houses get sacked, including some wealthy merchants that I've spent some amount of time studying. The rioting continues, and the merchants, the rioting continues. Morozov so Tsar Alexei like has a domestic urban crisis on his hands. What does he do? He's staying in the palace. He comes out and he announces that he is going to remove Boris Morozov, who is seen as kind of the real bad guy. He's going to remove his from his position. And Plasheyev was actually taken out onto Red Square for execution, as in the Tsar saying, well, okay, yeah, he's bad. You can have, or he's going to be officially executed, to be beheaded. But before that can happen, this crowd enraged gets their hands on him. They drag him into the marketplace where they cudgel him black and blue with axes and cut him asunder like a fish, an account says. And the pieces they left lying here and there. So things are getting quite violent. Traksionov, this other guy who has met the crowd's ire, he is executed. The crowd, so three very wealthy, kind of close to government elites are killed, and their corpses are horribly abused. So just days later, on June 10th, 1648, the merchants present the Tsar with a collective petition reminding him to rule justly. Aleksei, who loves Morozov is his tutor and his biggest guide and his closest advisor. And so Aleksei doesn't really want to do this, but he agrees. So he demoted Morozov, and then he says, I'll exile him up to some monastery in the north. He does that. Morozov gets to come back in a couple of years. People really hated him. He had, he had over 6,000 peasant households that were his personal property, and so he was a really hated figure. So this is a major domestic challenge to Tsar Alexei's reign, which really indicates that there's a tremendous amount of unrest. So what, in response to it, Aleksei, he recognizes that this is not good, and he's going to call together this Zemsky Sabor, and they're going to make a law code to try and kind of establish some order and a just order by 17th century standards in Muscovite. Even that, and that does a lot of good things, we might say, but it isn't the end of domestic unrest. There's another episode of major domestic unrest, and that comes in 1662. Actually, here I'll start sharing some pictures again that have. So here is a picture of some just subsequently imagined violence of the salt riots in 1648. Sorry, salt riots in 1648. And then here's another one. I don't have an image of the copper riots, but the next big event of domestic unrest that I want to tell you about are the copper riots. This happened in 1662. And again, the general population is really feeling a squeeze. One of the things they are feeling anxious about is money. Again, this comes back to money and the government trying to raise revenue for its wars. One way of raising money is to increase taxes. Another way that governments can sometimes raise money is by diluting the metal in coins. And there was an understanding that the Kremlin treasury had pretty much started, if it had silver money, it had started putting more and more copper into the coinage. And this was understood to be of lower value. The weights were different, so people could go to the market and kind of figure that out. And so then things get more expensive. And then inflation starts to happen in the Moscow economy. And this puts the squeeze on a lot of people. And then, so this isn't working very well. The government is diluting the money and printing more, but inflation is happening because people are understanding that the coins weigh a different amount of money. So in July 1662, a decree is published. So made on piece of paper, town criers go out and they're announcing this everywhere, that soon a new levy is going to be due. Now in America, for example, taxes are pretty, they're standard. You have your annual tax, and then some things are taxed, whether there's a sales tax or a restaurant tax, or there's all kinds of taxes, but they're they're constant. One of the things that government used to do is they would just announce a levy, say, he, on this day, you're going to have to pony up this much money for this campaign. So that was one of the ways that money could be raised. So there's this announcement that there's going to be a levy, and people don't like that news at all. And many flyers. So here, another clue that there is a print culture in Muscovy. A lot of flyers start to be, excuse me. So many flyers, pardon. So flyers are circulating saying, don't tolerate this. So we see some clues of a print culture of happening. And then again, crowds gather, it gets very ugly. Many houses of rich people were sacked. The crowd confronts the Tsar directly. And apparently he's on an outing when someone grabs at his clothes, just as a regiment of soldiers arrives as backup for him. And Aleksei reportedly, when a subject reached for his robe to kind of get his attention, he said, "Save me from these dogs." At which point the soldiers reacted violently. It was put down quickly, but it was violent. 7,000 people were executed, some sources tell us. 15,000 were allegedly sent into exile to Kazan, Siberia, and Astrakhan. To be perfectly honest, I have even a hard time trying to get my head around these numbers. Like, how many people would have had to been out in the streets to have 7,000 people killed and 15,000 sent into exile? And other punishments included, and this kind of gets into how the Muscovite legal system operated. Some people had their limbs removed, like hands could be cut off by thieves, tongues cut out for people that were saying inappropriate things. And everyone that was arrested had 3 letters of the word, the 3 letters of the word rebel stamped on their left cheek. Yeah, there were various ways of stamping people, but like a stamp imprinted on your left cheek and then sent into exile. Why was this done? If you're, it's cheaper than having a prison system, right? We've got this new place out there. It's hard to get people there. If we just send them there, it's clear that they're a criminal, so they don't belong back here in Moscow. That'll be immediately identifiable, but we don't have to kind of build and maintain a prison and feed them. And so that's kind of how exile worked. So that's another big episode in which the government reacts pretty harshly, and real violence happens very much. I think that we can see the copper riots, like the 1648 salt riots, as a reaction of, the population being pressed to meet state revenue needs. And then the last incident that I'll tell you about and here very quickly is the Stenka Razin revolt. Stenka Razin was a Cossack, and he'd gone into service for the Russian Tsar to fight against Kalmyk nomads, or rather he'd actually first gone into service doing diplomatic work, communicating with Kalmyk hordes in as early as 1661. He'd also gone on a pilgrimage up to Solovetsky Monastery in the north. He was very orthodox. So he's in the service of the Russian Tsar, but in 1668, he starts acting up against the state, and he conducts raids along the Caspian Sea against Persians at first, but he kind of gets reprimanded because the Persians are saying, yo, if you're going to attack us, we're going to attack you back. And Russia, kind of like it doesn't want to antagonize the Ottoman Empire, it didn't want to antagonize the Persians as well. So the Tsar, the government in Moscow, really doesn't want Cossacks getting under the skin, Cossacks that are associated with the Russian government getting under the skin of the Persians. So at any rate, he begins acting up. He returns in 1669 and he apologizes to the government in Astrakhan for acting up. He's pardoned for his misconduct. But then a year later, he seems to have raised an army and he sets off up the Volga, seizing towns, killing some people in the Tsar's service. Then he seized Astrakhan and he establishes a Cossack republic, he says. And he moves with his campaign back up the Volga River. Back up the Volga River. Let me, I don't have, I think I showed you before a picture of Stenka Razin. So this is a real challenge to state authority. To make a long story short, he ends up being caught. But it's noteworthy here that he attracts a lot of support along before he's caught. And as one historian put it, it attracted peasants yearning to be free of serfdom and townsmen resentful of taxation and the high price of liquor. And it appealed to those who hated or were confused by the new order of the church. What we haven't talked about, but what will become the schismatics, the old believers. Anyway, he's caught and he is taken to Red Square, where he is executed publicly by drawing and quartering in 1671. And so these three incidences, the Salt Riots of 1648, the Copper Riots of 1662, the Stenka Razin uprising of 1670-71, I want to put them before you for two reasons. One, I think the reign of Aleksei Mikhailovich is legitimately regarded as a successful reign, as a modernizing reign, where lots of things that we associate with modern governance is starting to happen. That said, it doesn't happen without real pain at the societal level and without a good amount of resistance and challenges to that domestic authority. So that's one reason I told you about them. The other reason that I'm telling you about them is that I think that oftentimes, and I can even pick up any newspaper nowadays and I can read something about, oh, Russia is used to autocratic power, the all-powerful czar. And we see that, we've seen that in the accounts we've read from Herberstein, and they are awed by these rituals, and they go back and say, oh, that czar is really all-powerful. Well, in the course of the 17th century, we'll have 4 occasions where crowds of everyday people breach the Kremlin, and we have made a major conflagration of violence. Does that sound to you like an all-powerful state and an all-powerful czar? I mean, the first time it happened, we saw it in at the wedding of the first false Dmitri. Of course, Shusky is playing there. He's ginning up the crowd to violence that breaches the Kremlin. So that's a real consideration. But nonetheless, common people breaching the Kremlin, high-ranking people dying. In this case, the czar himself getting killed. 1648, the common people breaching the Kremlin, and the czar even turns over some of the people to the crowd, and they really do a number on these elite bodies. And then 1662 in the Copper Riots, we see more of this. And then the other instance where we're going to have kind of common people and palace guards going over to the crowds happens in 1682, when there's a real succession crisis. So what I would just kind of leave you with is, the next time someone tells you about how powerful this state is, to remember that the walls of the Kremlin and real elites get taken 4 times over the course of the 17th century. Now, in 2021, though, I really have to amend my comments, because when I used to give this lecture, I used to compare this to, it was a moment some years ago where a woman who was in mental health crisis, evidently has been reported by some, drove a car into the iron pylons outside the Capitol. And before too many questions could be asked, she was shot dead, understood to be threatening the hallowed halls of government. And so I used to offer this as an example of America as no one ever talks about the American government in the way that we talk about the Russian autocratic government. And I used to make this point of how effectively impossible it was to breach the Capitol. But seeing what's happened in 2021, I recognize that I need to amend those I need to amend those comments because it no longer fits. What that means in terms of state power or whatnot remains to be seen. And I'm a historian, not a journalist. Just journalists are still working on kind of what's happened in the immediate, and it will be historians will need more hindsight to understand what's just happened. But for my purposes, I can just share with you that now I really need to change that lecture because the Capitol in 2021 has been breached in a way that I used to be confident wasn't a real possibility in American society. And with that, we'll wrap up and I will take questions.